The story we think we know is a simple one, a fairy tale for a child's bedside. A small boy, a large brute, a lucky shot. It is a story of the underdog, a comforting fable that the weak can overcome the strong. But this is a profound and dangerous misunderstanding. The truth is a far darker, stranger, and more terrible story. It is not a tale of luck, but of a world pushed to the very brink of annihilation. It is a story of a nation's soul rotting from the head down, of a failed king and a terrified army, of a monstrous, inhuman challenge, and of a secret, hidden destiny that was about to walk onto the stage of history from the most unlikely of places. To understand what truly happened in the Valley of Elah, we must first strip away the fable and immerse ourselves in the paralyzing fear of a nation that was not just losing a war, but was losing its God. This is the story of the Valley of Fear. The world of the 11th century before Christ was a brutal and unforgiving one, a world being reforged in the fires of a new and terrible technology, iron. For centuries, warfare in the ancient Near East had been the domain of bronze. Bronze was the metal of heroes, the substance of the great empires of Egypt and the Hittites. It was strong, reliable, but it had a fatal weakness. It was a composite, an alloy of copper and, crucially, tin. And tin was rare, a precious commodity that had to be imported over vast distances, making the production of bronze weapons and armor an expensive, state-level enterprise. The armies of the Israelites, a loose confederation of tribes only recently united under their first troubled king, were a Bronze Age people. Their swords, their spear tips, their helmets, what little they had, were made of this older, softer metal. They were a nation living in the past, but on the coastal plain, a new and formidable enemy had established itself, a people who had mastered the dark, alchemical art of smelting iron. These were the Philistines. They were not a simple tribe of desert raiders. They were a sophisticated, organized and technologically superior civilization, a remnant of the mysterious sea peoples who had swept out of the Aegean and brought the great Bronze Age empires to their knees. They possessed the secrets of the forge, the knowledge of how to heat iron ore to a much higher temperature than was needed for bronze, how to hammer out its impurities, and how to quench it into a metal that was harder, sharper, and far cheaper to produce than anything the Israelites could field. This was not a small advantage, it was a total war-winning asymmetry. An iron sword could shatter a bronze shield, an iron-tipped spear could punch through a bronze helmet. An army equipped with iron was not just better armed, it was operating on a different technological plane. The Bible itself records the devastating totality of this Philistine monopoly. Now there was no blacksmith to be found throughout all the land of Israel, the text tells us, for the Philistines said, "Lest the Hebrews make themselves swords or spears." The Israelites were a disarmed and subjugated people. If a farmer wanted to sharpen his own iron plowshare or his sickle, he had to go down to the Philistine cities and pay his enemy for the privilege. It was a state of profound and humiliating technological dependence, a constant, daily reminder of their own inferiority. This military and technological dominance was now being brought to bear in a final existential conflict. The Philistines were not content to simply rule the coastal plain. They sought to expand, to push eastward into the Judean hills, to conquer the Israelite heartland and reduce its people to a permanent state of vassalage. And so they gathered their army, a great host equipped with the terrifying weapons of the New Age, and marched into the territory of Judah. They made their camp on a hill between Soko and Azekah. In response, the king of Israel, Saul, gathered his own army, a hastily assembled militia of farmers and shepherds with their outdated bronze weapons and their farming implements. They made their camp on the opposite hill, and between the two armies lay the deep, wide ravine of the Valley of Elah. Here, the two forces were locked in a perfect, agonizing stalemate. The geography of the valley made a direct, massed assault by either side a suicidal proposition. To charge down the steep slope of one hill would be to expose your army's flank and to lose all momentum as you struggled up the other side, directly into the waiting spears of the enemy. And so, they waited. They were two nations holding their breath, two armies staring at each other across a silent, sun-drenched valley. But this was not a stalemate of equals. The Israelite camp was a place of quiet, corrosive dread. Every morning the soldiers would wake and see the sun glinting off the iron spear tips and the superior armor of the Philistine host across the valley. Every day they were reminded of their own technological nakedness, of the fragility of their bronze swords and leather shields. But their fear was not just technological, it was spiritual. Their greatest weapon, the favor of their God, had abandoned them, and the proof of that abandonment was sitting in the royal tent in the center of their own camp, their king. King Saul was a tragic figure, a man who had begun as a hero and was now decaying from the inside out. He had been chosen by God, anointed by the great prophet Samuel, a man taller than any of the people from his shoulders upward, a king who looked the part. His early reign was marked by glorious victories, by a charismatic leadership that had united the tribes and pushed back their enemies. He was the hope of a nation. But the pressures of kingship and the corrupting influence of power had exposed a deep flaw in his character. His reign was defined by two catastrophic acts of disobedience, two moments where his pride and his fear had caused him to defy a direct command from God, delivered through the prophet Samuel. The first had come at Gilgal. The Israelite army was facing a massive Philistine force, and his men were terrified, deserting in droves. He was to wait 7 days for Samuel to arrive and offer the pre-battle sacrifices to secure God's favor. But as the 7th day came to an end and Samuel had not yet appeared, Saul panicked. Fearing the complete collapse of his army, he took matters into his own hands. He, a king, not a priest, performed the sacred burnt offering himself, a profound violation of the religious order, an act that revealed his faith was not in God's timing, but in religious ritual and his own royal authority. The moment he finished, Samuel arrived and delivered a devastating verdict. "You have done foolishly. You have not kept the command of the Lord your God. Now your kingdom shall not continue." It was the first crack in the foundation of his reign. The second and final break came during the war against the Amalekites. The command from God had been absolute and brutal. He was to enact herem, a form of holy war in which the enemy was to be utterly destroyed as a sacrifice to God. Every man, woman, child, and animal. It was a terrible command, but it was the test of his absolute obedience. Saul won the military victory, but he failed the spiritual test. He spared the enemy king, Agag, as a trophy of his victory, and he and his men spared the best of the sheep and the oxen, rationalizing their disobedience by claiming they intended to sacrifice these animals to the Lord later. It was an act of pride disguised as piety. He had placed his own judgment, his own desire for plunder and prestige, above the clear, absolute command of his God. When Samuel confronted him, Saul's excuses were met with one of the most powerful rebukes in the entire Bible. "Has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord?" Samuel thundered. "Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice. For rebellion is as the sin of divination, and presumption is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king." As Saul begged for forgiveness and grabbed at the hem of Samuel's robe, the cloth tore in his hand. Samuel seized upon the symbol. "The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you this day," he prophesied, "and has given it to a neighbor of yours who is better than you." From that day forward, Saul was a man living a nightmare. The text tells us that the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and a harmful spirit from the Lord tormented him. He was a king in name only, a hollow crown on a haunted head. He was plagued by fits of deep, black depression, by sudden, violent rages, by a paranoia that saw enemies and conspiracies in every shadow. His court was a place of fear and gloom. He was a broken man, and his brokenness radiated outwards, infecting the entire army that he was now supposed to lead. The soldiers camped in the valley of Elah looked at their king and saw not a confident, divinely appointed leader, but a moody, unstable man who was known to fall into dark trances and throw spears at his own servants. They knew the stories of Samuel's rejection. They could feel the cold absence of God's favor over their camp. They were a people whose entire identity was based on their covenant with their divine warrior, YHWH of hosts. And now, at this moment of supreme national crisis, their God was silent, and their king was a spiritual ruin. It was into this atmosphere of profound technological, psychological, and spiritual impotence that a new and even more terrifying enemy appeared. The stalemate was about to be broken by the emergence of a single man, a man who was not just a warrior, but a walking, breathing monument to the Philistines' power and the Israelites' deepest fears. The Valley of Fear was about to find its voice, and it was the voice of a giant. The two armies faced each other across the silent valley, paralyzed by the grim logic of the terrain. The air was thick with a waiting dread, the tension of a drawn bowstring. It was into this charged atmosphere that the Philistines unleashed their ultimate weapon, a weapon designed not just to win the battle, but to shatter the very soul of the Israelite army before the first blow was even struck. This weapon was not a new siege engine or a secret chariot formation. It was a man, but to call him a man is to diminish the sheer, monstrous reality of what the cowering Israelite soldiers saw emerging from the Philistine lines. He was a figure of mythological proportions, a walking embodiment of iron, bronze, and brutal, overwhelming power. His name was Goliath, from the city of Gath, one of the 5 great cities of the Philistine Pentapolis and the legendary home of an ancient race of giants, the Anakim. He was the champion. The text of the scripture, usually so spare and understated, lingers on the description of Goliath with a kind of awestruck, meticulous terror. It is a detailed inventory of a demigod's war gear, a catalogue designed to impress upon the reader the absolute, seemingly insurmountable nature of the threat he represented. His height alone was a thing of legend, 6 cubits and a span. The exact measurement is debated, but it places him somewhere between 9 and 10 feet tall, a true giant, a man who would tower over the tallest soldier in the Israelite army, making him seem like a child. He was a living mountain of flesh and muscle, a product of generations of selective breeding for size and strength, but it was his armor, his panoply, that truly declared his invincibility. It was a complete, head-to-toe encasement in the most advanced military technology of the age, a gleaming testament to the Philistine mastery of metallurgy. On his head was a helmet of burnished bronze, protecting his skull from blows. On his body, he wore a massive coat of scale mail, a sophisticated form of armor made of hundreds of overlapping bronze scales sewn onto a leather or linen backing. It would have been flexible, allowing for movement, but incredibly dense and heavy, capable of deflecting sword cuts and spear thrusts. The text specifies its weight with a precision born of terror: 5,000 shekels of bronze, which translates to well over 100 pounds. The sheer, crushing weight of his body armor alone was more than most ordinary men could even lift, let alone fight in. On his legs he wore greaves of bronze, curved plates that protected his shins from attack. Slung between his shoulders was a javelin, or kidon, of bronze, a throwing weapon for engaging at a distance. His primary offensive weapon was his spear. It was a weapon of terrifying proportions. Its shaft was described as being like a weaver's beam, a comparison to the massive, thick wooden rollers used in a large loom. It would have been a spear of immense length and thickness, more like a small tree than a handheld weapon. And at its tip was a spearhead of iron, the dreaded metal of the New Age. Its weight was also specified: 600 shekels of iron, or about 15 pounds. This was just the weight of the spearhead itself. The entire weapon, a combination of the heavy wooden shaft and the massive iron point, would have been an incredibly powerful and destructive force, capable of punching through any shield or armor the Israelites possessed. He was, in essence, a walking, mobile artillery piece. And he did not come alone. Walking before him was a shield bearer, another large soldier whose sole job was to carry a massive, full-body shield, a portable wall behind which the champion could advance, protected from sling stones or arrows. Goliath was a complete, self-contained weapons system, a perfect fusion of immense physical power and the pinnacle of military technology. He was the Philistine war machine made flesh. With his armor gleaming in the morning sun, this monstrous figure would stride down the slope of the Philistine hill and take his stand in the center of the valley floor. And then he would issue his challenge, his voice a booming, amplified roar that would echo off the hills and strike fear into the hearts of every Israelite soldier. "Why have you come out to draw up for battle?" he would bellow, his tone a mixture of arrogance and contempt. "Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me." The proposal he offered was a common, if high-stakes, practice in the ancient world, trial by champion. It was a way to settle a conflict and avoid the massive bloodshed of a full-scale battle by having two chosen warriors fight as representatives for their entire nations. The stakes of this single combat were absolute, a winner-take-all wager for the future of two peoples. "If he is able to fight with me and kill me," Goliath declared, "then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." This was not a border skirmish. It was a battle for national sovereignty, for the very freedom of the Israelite people. But Goliath's challenge went beyond the standard formula of champion warfare. It was not just a military challenge, it was a theological one. After laying out the terms, he would deliver his final, blasphemous taunt. "I defy the ranks of Israel this day," he roared. "Give me a man, that we may fight together." The word defy here means to reproach, to scorn, to treat with contempt. He was not just challenging the Israelite army, he was scorning the God they claimed to serve. His very presence was a theological argument. He was a living demonstration of the superiority of the Philistine gods, Dagon and Baal, over the unseen, unheard, and seemingly absent God of Israel. Every day that he stood there, unchallenged, was another piece of evidence that the God of Israel was a fraud, a weak and powerless deity who was either unwilling or unable to defend the honor of his own people. The text tells us that this ritual was repeated relentlessly for 40 days. Every morning and every evening, Goliath would emerge and issue his terrifying challenge. This 40-day period is deeply significant. It is a number that, in the biblical narrative, often signifies a period of testing, trial, and judgment. It was for 40 days that the rains of the flood fell. It was for 40 years that the Israelites would wander in the wilderness. It was for 40 days that Jesus would be tempted by Satan in the desert. This was not just a military standoff. It was a period of profound spiritual trial for the entire nation of Israel, and it was a trial they were catastrophically failing. The effect of this daily psychological warfare was devastating. The text describes the reaction of the Israelite army with a simple, powerful phrase. When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. The initial fear of the first day had, over the course of 40 days, calcified into a state of profound, paralyzing terror. Their morale had been systematically dismantled. The booming voice of the giant had become the soundtrack to their national humiliation. Every morning they would wake with a knot of dread in their stomachs, knowing that the monster would soon emerge. They would see his massive form, they would hear his contemptuous words, and they would feel their courage shrivel within them. The fear infected everyone, from the lowest foot soldier to the king himself. Saul, the man who was supposed to be their champion, the man chosen for his height and his strength, was as terrified as any of his men. He was a king in crisis, his own spirit tormented by a harmful spirit from the Lord. He was a man without divine guidance, without inner conviction. He sat in his tent, hearing the daily taunts, and he did nothing. He offered a reward, great riches, the hand of his own daughter in marriage, and a tax exemption for the champion's family. But these were the desperate incentives of a king who knew he could not, or would not, fight himself. He was a hollow king, and his hollowness was now being exposed for his entire army to see. His failure to act, his inability to answer the challenge, was a public confirmation of his rejection by God. The spiritual rot at the head of the nation had now paralyzed the entire body. Imagine the psychological state of the Israelite camp during these 40 days. It would have been a place of whispered conversations, of averted eyes, of a deepening, corrosive shame. The soldiers would look at each other, and each would see his own fear reflected in the other's face. They would look at their king and see a man as paralyzed as they were. They would look up at the sky and feel only the silence of their God. The daily ritual of Goliath's challenge was a perfect piece of psychological warfare because it was designed to create a narrative of hopelessness. It was a story told twice a day for 40 days, and the plot of the story was simple. We are powerful, you are weak. Our gods are real. Your God is a lie. We are the future. You are the past. Surrender is your only option. Goliath was more than just a large man with a big spear. He was the physical manifestation of Israel's deepest insecurities. His iron weapons were a symbol of their technological inferiority. His immense size and strength were a symbol of their physical weakness. His arrogant blasphemies were a symbol of their spiritual abandonment. He was a monster perfectly engineered to exploit every one of their fears. He was not just a champion, he was a walking, talking argument for the non-existence of the God of Israel. His 40-day challenge was a slow, methodical, and brutally effective siege on the heart and soul of the nation. By the end of this period, the Israelite army was not just a military force in a stalemate. It was a congregation of broken men, a nation on the very brink of spiritual and political collapse. They were utterly, completely, and hopelessly terrified. And into this valley of profound and universal fear, a boy was about to walk, sent by his father on a simple errand to deliver some bread and cheese. The valley was a crucible of fear, a stage upon which the slow, agonizing humiliation of a nation was being performed twice daily. The army of Israel was frozen, its spirit slowly being ground to dust by the relentless psychological warfare of the Philistine champion. But the destiny of a nation is not always forged in the councils of kings or on the front lines of its armies. Sometimes it is nurtured in obscurity, in a quiet place far from the noise of history, in the heart of a person that the world has not yet learned to notice. While King Saul and his warriors were cowering on their hill, the future of Israel was a teenage boy sitting on a rock in the lonely hills of Bethlehem, guarding his father's sheep. This is the story of the secret king, of a hidden anointing that had already set in motion the events that would bring this unknown shepherd boy into a direct, world-altering collision with the giant. The story of the secret king begins with the final tragic rejection of the reigning one. The prophet Samuel, the great spiritual authority of his age, the man who had anointed Saul as Israel's first king, was now a man in mourning. He was grieving for Saul, the charismatic leader who had shown such promise but had shattered his own destiny through pride and disobedience. But God's voice came to Samuel, a voice that was impatient with grief and focused on the future. "How long will you grieve over Saul?" the Lord asked, "since I have rejected him from being king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided for myself a king among his sons." The command was a dangerous one. Saul, for all his spiritual decay, was still the king, a man prone to fits of paranoid, murderous rage. For the prophet to anoint a new king while the old one still lived was an act of high treason, a direct threat to the throne. Samuel himself was afraid. "How can I go?" he asked. "If Saul hears it, he will kill me." God provided him with a cover story. "Take a heifer with you and say, 'I have come to sacrifice to the Lord.'" He was to stage a religious festival in the small provincial town of Bethlehem, and under the guise of this sacred ritual, he would perform his secret revolutionary act. And so, the aged prophet, his horn filled with the sacred anointing oil, made his way to Bethlehem. His arrival caused a stir. The elders of the town, knowing his reputation as a kingmaker and a bringer of divine judgment, came out to meet him, trembling. "Do you come peaceably?" they asked, afraid that he had come to pronounce a curse upon their town. Samuel reassured them and invited them, along with a man named Jesse and his sons, to the sacrificial feast. At the feast, the true purpose of his visit began to unfold. One by one, the sons of Jesse were brought before the prophet. The first to appear was Eliab, the eldest. He was a man in the mold of King Saul, tall, handsome, with the bearing of a warrior. When Samuel saw him, he was immediately impressed. "Surely," he thought to himself, "the Lord's anointed is before him." He was looking for a king with the eyes of the world, judging by outward appearance, by strength and stature. But the voice of the Lord corrected him instantly with a lesson that would become the central theme of this entire story. "Do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart." This was a profound and radical redefinition of what it meant to be a king. The age of the tall, handsome, but spiritually flawed Saul was over. God was looking for something different, a quality of the heart, an inner character that was invisible to the human eye. And so, one by one, Jesse's sons were paraded before the prophet. Abinadab was brought forward, and the Lord said, "Neither has the Lord chosen this one." Shammah was brought next, and he too was rejected. 7 of Jesse's sons, all of them strong, capable men, passed before Samuel, and each time, the divine verdict was the same: the Lord has not chosen these. Samuel, now confused, turned to Jesse. "Are all your sons here?" he asked. And Jesse, with a kind of dismissive afterthought, replied, "There remains yet the youngest, but behold, he is keeping the sheep." The youngest son had not even been considered important enough to be invited to the sacrificial feast with his brothers. He was the runt of the litter, a boy consigned to the most menial and solitary of tasks, shepherding. But Samuel, now understanding that God's choice would defy all human expectation, insisted. "Send and get him," he commanded, "for we will not sit down to eat until he comes here." And so a messenger was sent out to the fields, to the lonely pastures on the hillsides surrounding Bethlehem, and there they found him. The text describes him as ruddy and had beautiful eyes and was handsome. He was a youth, a boy on the cusp of manhood, his skin weathered by the sun, his hands calloused from his staff and his sling. His name was David. He was brought before the prophet, blinking in the unfamiliar light of the feast, out of place among his older warrior brothers. And as he stood there, the boy who smelled of sheep and the open air, the voice of the Lord came to Samuel with a final, decisive command. "Arise, anoint him, for this is the he." In that moment, in the midst of his own family who did not yet understand the significance of the act, Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed David. The oil, a symbol of the Holy Spirit, of divine consecration and empowerment, was poured over the head of the shepherd boy. And the text tells us, the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David from that day forward. It was a secret coronation, a hidden transfer of divine authority. In the eyes of God, David, the shepherd boy, was now the true king of Israel. But in the eyes of the world, he was still just the youngest son of Jesse, a boy whose only responsibility was a flock of sheep. He would return to his fields, to his solitary life, but he would return a changed man, a man carrying the secret, awesome weight of a divine destiny. To understand the man who would later face Goliath, it is essential to understand the world that had shaped him in those lonely fields. The life of a shepherd in the Judean hills was not a peaceful pastoral existence. It was a life of constant vigilance, of hardship, and of profound solitude. The wilderness around Bethlehem was not a gentle pasture. It was a dangerous place, home to predators. Lions and bears, though rare, were a real and present threat to the flock. A shepherd was the sole protector of his sheep. He could not run from danger, he had to confront it. His primary weapons were his staff, a heavy wooden club for close-quarter defense, and his sling. The sling, which we now think of as a child's toy, was, in the hands of an expert, a deadly and sophisticated long-range weapon. It consisted of a simple leather or woven pouch with 2 long cords. A stone was placed in the pouch, and the shepherd would whirl it around his head at a tremendous speed before releasing one of the cords, launching the stone with incredible velocity and accuracy. Archaeological finds and ancient texts confirm that expert slingers were a formidable part of many ancient armies. They could hurl a projectile at speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour, with enough force to shatter a skull or pierce through armor. A shepherd like David, who would have spent thousands of hours practicing his aim on targets of opportunity, a distant rock, a circling bird, would have been a master of this weapon, a long-range marksman of lethal precision. His life as a shepherd was not just a training in weaponry, it was a profound spiritual education. In the long hours of solitude under the vast, silent sky, he would have developed a deep, personal, and intimate relationship with his God, far from the formal rituals and corrupt politics of the royal court. His psalms, which he would later write, are filled with the imagery of this life: God as his shepherd, the comfort of the rod and the staff, the quiet waters, the dark valleys. His faith was not a theoretical, inherited doctrine. It was a lived, daily reality, a constant reliance on God for protection against both the visible dangers of the wilderness and the invisible anxieties of the soul. It was in this lonely crucible that he learned the courage and the faith that would define him. It was here that he learned to see the world not as man sees, but as God sees. This secret anointing, this hidden life of training, is the key that unlocks the entire story of his confrontation with Goliath. David would not arrive in the valley of Elah as an ignorant, impetuous boy seeking adventure. He would arrive as the secret, divinely appointed king of Israel, a man upon whom the Spirit of the Lord had already rushed. He would arrive as a battle-hardened warrior, his skills honed in life-or-death combat against predators far more unpredictable than a lumbering giant. And he would arrive with a faith that was not based on the failed institutions of Saul's kingdom, but was forged in the quiet, absolute certainty of his own personal experience with the living God. The world saw a shepherd boy. God saw his champion. The stage was now set. The failed king was cowering in his tent. The monstrous champion was roaring in the valley, and the secret king, the boy with the heart that God had chosen, was about to be sent on a simple errand by his father, an errand that would place him on a direct collision course with his own and his nation's incredible destiny. The 40 days of shame had nearly run their course. The army of Israel was a trapped and broken thing, its courage eroded to dust by the giant's relentless psychological assault. King Saul, a hollow crown on a haunted head, sat paralyzed in his tent, a king in name only. The entire nation was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable, humiliating surrender. It is into this tableau of absolute despair that a new figure walks onto the stage. He does not arrive as a hero, a captain, or a prophet. He arrives as a delivery boy, a teenager on a mundane errand from his father, carrying a humble offering of bread and cheese. He is an outsider, an observer, a boy from the sheepfolds who is about to wander into a crisis of kings. His arrival will be met not with welcome, but with the scorn of his own family and the skepticism of his own king, the first of many confrontations that will reveal the profound gulf between the world's fearful, worldly wisdom and his own radical, God-breathed faith. Back in Bethlehem, the elderly Jesse, a man with 3 sons on the front lines, was growing anxious. He had heard no news from the valley. He decided to send his youngest son, David, the one he had left behind to tend the sheep, as a courier. His instructions were simple and domestic, a perfect portrait of a father's concern in a time of war. "Take for your brothers an ephah of this parched grain and these 10 loaves," Jesse instructed, "and run to the camp to your brothers. Also take these 10 cheeses to the commander of their 1,000. See if your brothers are well, and bring some token from them." It was a mission of sustenance and intelligence gathering, a task for the boy who was not considered a soldier. David, obedient to his father, rose early in the morning, left his sheep with another keeper, and set out on the journey to the valley of Elah. He arrived at the camp just as the Israelite army was moving into its battle formations, raising a great war cry. It was a hollow, performative gesture, the morning ritual of a terrified army pretending to be brave. David left his supplies with the keeper of the baggage and ran to the ranks to find his brothers and greet them. And as he was talking with them, the scene that had paralyzed Israel for 40 days unfolded once more. From the Philistine lines, the champion emerged. Goliath of Gath, a walking mountain of bronze and iron, strode into the valley and began to shout his daily taunts, his booming voice filled with contempt. And David witnessed, for the first time, the reaction of the Israelite soldiers. "And all the men of Israel," the text says with a brutal honesty, "when they saw the man, fled from him and were much afraid." David, who had not been subjected to the 40 days of psychological conditioning, who had not marinated in the army's collective fear, saw the scene with fresh, unclouded eyes. And what he saw did not fill him with terror, it filled him with a profound and righteous indignation. He was not looking at the giant's height or the weight of his spear, he was listening to his words. He heard the defiance, the scorn, the blasphemy against the army of his nation and the honor of his God. And he was appalled. His reaction was not fear, but a kind of bewildered, burning anger. He turned to the soldiers standing near him, and his first question was not one of military strategy, but of theology and economics. "What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine?" he asked, "and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God?" This question is the key to his entire character. In a single sentence, he reframes the entire conflict. The soldiers see an unbeatable giant. David sees an uncircumcised Philistine, a man who stands outside the covenant, a pagan who has no claim on the protection of the true God. The soldiers see a military crisis. David sees a reproach, a stain on the honor of the nation, and most importantly, he does not see the army of Saul, he sees the armies of the living God. He is looking at the problem not from a human perspective, but from a divine one, and he immediately links this spiritual problem to a practical reward. He is asking, what is the bounty on this blasphemer's head? It is the question of a man who is already contemplating action. The soldiers, likely with a kind of weary amusement, repeated the king's offer. Great riches, the king's daughter in marriage, a tax-free future for his family. But as David was making these inquiries, his eldest brother, Eliab, overheard him. Eliab, the tall, handsome son whom the prophet Samuel had first mistaken for the chosen king, was filled with a sudden, hot anger at his youngest brother. His reaction was one of pure, familial scorn, a big brother's contempt for a presumptuous upstart. "Why have you come down?" he sneered. "And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle." Eliab's accusation was a complete and utter misreading of his brother's character, yet it reveals the deep-seated perspective of the fearful army. He cannot comprehend David's righteous anger, so he projects onto him his own worldly motivations. He accuses him of being a glory hound, a slacker who has abandoned his duties to come and spectate at the war, a boy with a proud and evil heart. He belittles him, reminding him of his lowly status as the keeper of those few sheep. But David, the secret king, was not to be intimidated by his brother's scorn. His response was calm but firm. "What have I done now?" he asked. "Was it not but a word?" He refused to be drawn into a family squabble. He simply turned away from Eliab and continued to ask the same questions of the other soldiers, his focus unbroken. His words, however, did not go unnoticed. A boy in the camp of a terrified army was openly talking about killing the giant. It was a sentiment so audacious, so contrary to the prevailing mood of despair, that it was bound to attract attention. The report of David's words made its way up the chain of command until finally it reached the royal tent. King Saul, desperate for any flicker of hope, any deviation from the monotonous script of fear, commanded that the boy be brought to him. And so, David, the shepherd boy, was ushered into the presence of Saul, the failed king. It was a meeting of two anointings, two worlds. Saul, the tall, physically imposing king chosen by the people, now spiritually broken and tormented. David, the ruddy, handsome youth, outwardly a boy, but inwardly filled with the rushing spirit of the Lord. Saul would have looked at this boy, perhaps with a mixture of pity and desperation, and listened as David made one of the most audacious and seemingly naive proposals in military history. "Let no man's heart fail because of him," David declared, speaking of the giant with a stunning lack of fear. "Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." Saul's response was that of a seasoned, pragmatic, and utterly defeated military commander. He looked at the boy before him, a youth who had not yet even begun to shave, and he saw only weakness. "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him," he said, his voice lightly heavy with a weary paternalistic kindness. "For you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth." It was a simple, brutal, and entirely logical assessment of the situation. He was stating the obvious. This was a mismatch of epic proportions. It would be sending a lamb to the slaughter, but David had an answer, and his answer was a story. It was a story from his own life, a narrative designed to reframe his entire identity in the king's eyes. He did not argue military theory. He gave a personal testimony. "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father," he began. "And when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him." Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God." This was a brilliant and powerful piece of rhetoric. David took his humble, menial job as a shepherd, a job his own brother had just mocked, and he reframed it as an elite, high-stakes military training ground. He was telling Saul, "I am not an inexperienced boy. I am a seasoned warrior. My enemies have just been of a different kind. I have faced down the terror of the wilderness. I have fought predators that are faster, more agile, and more unpredictable than this lumbering, armored man, and I have won." He equated the lion and the bear with the uncircumcised Philistine, placing the giant not in the category of an invincible demigod, but in the category of a wild, dangerous beast that needed to be put down. And then he delivered his final theological punchline. He did not take credit for his own victories. "The Lord, who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear," he declared, "will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." He made it clear that his confidence was not in his own strength, but in the proven, battle-tested power of his God. He was not just offering his own courage, he was offering God's deliverance. Saul, the man from whom the Spirit of the Lord had departed, listened to this boy who spoke with such absolute experiential faith in the God who had abandoned him. And something in Saul was moved. Perhaps it was a flicker of his own long-lost faith. Perhaps it was the sheer, desperate hope that this boy might actually be what he claimed to be. Or perhaps he simply saw a political opportunity. If the boy succeeded, it was a victory for Israel. If he failed, he was just a shepherd boy, a minor, disposable loss. Whatever his reasoning, the king made his decision. He gave his consent. "Go," he said to David, "and the Lord be with you." It was a blessing that, for Saul himself, had become an empty phrase. Having given his permission, Saul then did the only logical thing a king could do to prepare a champion for battle. He tried to equip him. Then Saul clothed David with his own armor. He placed a helmet of bronze on the boy's head and dressed him in his own royal coat of mail. It was a gesture of immense honor, a transfer of the king's own identity onto the young champion. Saul was trying to make David into a miniature version of himself, to make him fit the conventional image of a warrior. He was trying to turn the shepherd into a soldier. David strapped the king's own sword over the armor, and then he tried to walk. The result was clumsy and comical. The armor was massive, made for a man who was a head taller than anyone else in Israel. It would have swallowed the teenage David. The sheer weight of it, combined with its ill fit, would have made him slow, awkward, and completely unable to fight with the agility that was his only physical advantage. The text says, "He tried in vain to go, for he had not tested them." He was trapped, weighed down by a system of fighting that was not his own. And it is here that David makes his second, and perhaps his most profound, act of defiance. The first was his refusal to be intimidated by the giant. The second was his refusal to be encumbered by the king. He turned to Saul and said, "I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them." And so he took them off. He shrugged off the king's bronze helmet. He unbuckled the king's heavy coat of mail. He laid aside the king's sword. He stood before Saul, once again, as a simple shepherd. This was more than just a practical decision. It was a powerful, deeply symbolic act. He was rejecting Saul's failed way of being. He was refusing to fight the battle on the world's terms, to use the conventional, heavy, and ultimately useless tools of the rejected, terrified king. He was choosing to be himself. He was choosing to rely not on the borrowed, ill-fitting strength of a failed human system, but on the proven, tested, and agile power of his own God. This was the moment that the battle was truly won. It was won not in the valley with a stone, but here, in the king's tent, with a simple, courageous act of refusal. He had faced down the scorn of his brother and the skepticism of his king, and he had prevailed. Now, armed with nothing but his faith and the simple tools of his own humble trade, he was ready to face the giant. The royal tent, with its heavy scent of leather, lamp oil, and the king's own quiet despair, was now behind him. David had politely, but firmly, shrugged off the weight of the king's world. He had refused the armor, the helmet, the sword, the entire apparatus of conventional failing power. By taking off Saul's gear, he had done more than simply choose a different set of weapons. He had made a profound theological and strategic statement. He had declared that this battle would not be won by the methods of a spiritually bankrupt kingdom, but by a different kind of power, a power that was lighter, faster, more agile, and rooted in a reality that the armored men on the hill could no longer perceive. He was now free to be himself, the shepherd, a role his brother had scorned and his king had pitied, but a role that had, in the lonely wilderness, forged him into the perfect weapon for this very moment. This is the story of that choice, an exploration of the seemingly humble arsenal he assembled and the deep, unconventional wisdom behind his rejection of the armor. Saul's offer of his armor was, from a worldly perspective, an act of supreme generosity and honor. The king was bestowing upon this unknown boy the very best equipment the kingdom had to offer, the symbols of his own royal authority and military prowess. For a commoner to wear the king's armor was to be elevated, to be transformed from a peasant into a temporary prince. To refuse such an honor was a bold, almost insubordinate act. David's statement, "I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them," was a masterpiece of diplomacy. He did not say, "Your armor is useless," or "Your way of fighting is a failure." He framed his refusal in the practical, humble language of a craftsman. He was saying, "These are not my tools. I do not know how to use them. They do not fit me." But the symbolic undertones were immense. Saul's armor represented the entire worldly, human-centered approach to the problem of Goliath. It was a strategy based on matching strength with strength, on the belief that a physical threat must be met with a physical defense of equal or greater measure. This was the logic that had paralyzed the Israelite army for 40 days. They looked at Goliath's massive armor and mighty spear, and because they had nothing comparable, they concluded that the fight was impossible. Saul, by offering his own armor, was trying to make David a participant in this failed logic, a smaller version of the very thing they were all afraid of. He was trying to make David fight Goliath's fight. David's refusal was a rejection of this entire paradigm. He understood, with a clarity that no one else in the camp possessed, that to fight Goliath on his own terms was to guarantee defeat. To put on heavy armor and engage the giant in a close-quarters sword fight would be suicide for a smaller, lighter man. The giant's superior reach, his immense strength, and the sheer momentum of his 15-pound spearhead would make short work of any traditionally armed opponent. David's only hope lay in asymmetry, in refusing to play the giant's game. He had to change the rules of the engagement. He had to turn it from a contest of strength into a contest of speed, accuracy, and above all, faith. And so he left the king's tent and walked away from the symbols of worldly power. He did not go to the armory. He went, instead, to the wadi, the dry stream bed that ran through the bottom of the valley. He was returning to his own world, to the familiar landscape of a shepherd. There, he stooped down and began to select his ammunition. The text tells us, with a beautiful and deliberate simplicity, that he chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the stream. Let us pause and consider the deep significance of this simple act. He was not picking up random rocks. He was choosing his weapons with the care of a master craftsman. The stones in a wadi, tumbled and worn by centuries of seasonal floods, would be perfectly smooth, dense, and aerodynamic. They were nature's perfect projectiles. A shepherd would know the feel of a good stone, its weight, its balance in the pouch of a sling. He was an expert selecting his tools. He was not improvising. He was arming himself with the weapons he had tested 1,000 times over in the wilderness. The number 5 is also deeply resonant. From a purely practical standpoint, it was a sensible choice. It showed that David, for all his faith, was not a fool. He was preparing for contingencies. If his first shot missed or was deflected, he had 4 more chances. But the number carries a deeper symbolic weight. Some commentators have noted that Goliath, according to other passages in the Old Testament, had 4 giant relatives, also Philistine champions. The 5 stones could thus be seen as a statement of David's readiness to take on the entire family of giants, 1 stone for each. Others see the number 5 in the Bible as often representing grace and divine favor. David was not just arming himself with stones. He was arming himself with the grace of God. Whatever the intended meaning, the image is one of calm, deliberate, and thoughtful preparation. He was not rushing into battle with a blind, foolish faith. He was a professional, preparing his arsenal for a familiar task. With his 5 smooth stones tucked into the shepherd's bag he carried, he took up his other 2 weapons, his staff and his sling. The staff was a simple, stout wooden club, a tool for guiding the flock and for fending off predators at close range. It was a defensive weapon, a symbol of his pastoral authority. But his primary offensive weapon, the one that would change the course of history, was his sling. It is here that we must completely divest ourselves of the modern, cartoonish image of the slingshot. The ancient sling was not a child's toy. It was a sophisticated and deadly weapon of war, a key component of many ancient armies, including those of the Assyrians, Persians, and Romans. In the hands of a trained expert like David, it was a lethal, high-velocity projectile launcher. The mechanics were simple but devastating. The slinger would place a stone, often a lead or stone projectile weighing several ounces, into the leather pouch. He would then begin to whirl the sling, building up immense centrifugal force. A skilled slinger could spin the pouch at a rate of 6 or 7 revolutions per second, generating incredible speed. At the precise moment, he would release one of the cords and the pouch would fly open, launching the stone with a silent, almost invisible trajectory. Ballistic studies have shown that a typical sling stone of that era could be launched at speeds well over 100 miles per hour. The kinetic energy delivered by such a projectile would be immense, comparable to that of a modern .44 Magnum handgun bullet. It was a weapon with a significant effective range, far greater than that of a thrown spear, and an accuracy that, in the hands of a master, was legendary. Ancient writers speak of slingers who could hit a target the size of a coin from 100 paces. This was not a weapon for harassing an enemy, it was a weapon for killing him. Its primary tactical advantage was its ability to strike a deadly blow from a distance, incapacitating an armored, slow-moving opponent before he could ever bring his own heavy, close-range weapons to bear. This was the genius of David's choice. He had rejected the heavy armor and the short-range sword of the Israelite king and had instead chosen a lightweight, long-range weapon system that was perfectly suited to his own skills and perfectly designed to exploit his opponent's weakness. Goliath, for all his strength and armor, was a walking fortress, a heavy tank. And like a tank, he had a vulnerability. His massive armor protected his torso and his legs. His helmet protected his skull, but his face, his eyes, his nose, his mouth, his forehead, was necessarily exposed for him to see and breathe. This small, fatal target was all David needed. He was not planning to engage Goliath in a contest of brute force. He was planning to act as a sniper, to deliver a single, precise, high-velocity projectile to a specific, unprotected kill zone, long before the giant could even get close enough to swing his massive spear. David's choice, therefore, was not an act of naive, reckless faith. It was an act of supreme strategic brilliance, a masterpiece of asymmetric warfare. He had correctly analyzed his opponent's strengths and weaknesses and his own, and he had chosen the one weapon system that gave him the best possible chance of victory. He was stepping onto the battlefield not as a sacrificial lamb, but as a highly trained special forces operator, a long-range marksman about to face a heavily armed but slow-moving target. But for David, the strategic brilliance of his choice was secondary to its spiritual significance. His confidence was not ultimately in the velocity of his sling or the smoothness of his stones. His confidence was in his God. The sling was merely the instrument through which God's power would be delivered. By rejecting Saul's armor, he was making a visible public declaration that this battle belonged not to the king, but to the Lord. He was deliberately stripping himself of all the conventional symbols of human power and protection, making himself utterly vulnerable in the eyes of the world, so that when the victory came, there would be no doubt as to its true source. No one would be able to say, Saul's armor won the day. They would be forced to say, the Lord has delivered him. And so, he made his way from the stream bed towards the center of the valley. He was a bizarre and almost pathetic sight to the two armies watching from the hills. He was a boy, dressed in the simple tunic of a shepherd, with no helmet, no armor, no shield. In his one hand, he carried a simple wooden club. In his other, a sling dangled from his wrist. He looked less like a national champion and more like a boy who had gotten lost on his way to pasture his flock. To the Israelites, it must have been a moment of profound confusion and shame. This was their champion, this unarmed boy? To the Philistines, it must have been a moment of high comedy, a deep, insulting joke. The army of Israel, after 40 days of cowering, had finally sent out a challenger, and it was a child with a stick. They were about to learn, in the most brutal way imaginable, that they were profoundly misjudging the nature of the man who was walking towards them and the devastating power of the simple, tested tools he carried in his hand. The preliminaries were over. The choices had been made. On one side of the valley stood the champion of the Philistines, a towering monument of bronze and iron, a creature of pure, worldly power, his massive form shimmering in the heat rising from the valley floor. On the other side, a boy, a shepherd, armed with the humble, tested tools of his trade and an unwavering, radical faith. The two armies of Israel and Philistia, thousands of men, held their breath on the opposing hillsides, silent witnesses to a duel that would decide their fate. The space between the two champions was more than just a physical distance. It was a vast, yawning gulf between two entirely different conceptions of reality, two irreconcilable worldviews. That gulf was about to be closed. This is the story of that final, fateful walk, of a war of words that was a clash of gods, and of a single, smooth stone that would bring a giant and an entire age crashing to the earth. David began his solitary walk down the slope of the Israelite hill and into the open, sun-drenched floor of the valley. Every eye was upon him. For the Philistines, it was a moment of supreme, arrogant confidence. For the Israelites, it was a moment of heart-stopping, agonizing suspense. Imagine the courage it took for David to take those steps. He was walking away from the safety of his own army, into the no-man's land, his back to his own people, his face towards the monster that had paralyzed his entire nation with fear for 40 days. He was utterly alone. He was the embodiment of unconventional faith, a walking refutation of the fearful worldly logic that gripped every other man in his army. As David drew closer, Goliath and his shield-bearer began to advance to meet him, and as the giant got his first clear look at his challenger, his expression of martial readiness must have curdled into one of pure, incredulous contempt. He saw not a warrior, not an armored soldier, but a youth, ruddy and handsome, a boy whose chin was likely still smooth. He saw the simple shepherd's tunic, the staff, the sling. This was not an opponent, this was an insult. The Israelites, in his view, were not just cowardly, they were now openly mocking him, sending a boy out to do a man's job. His warrior's pride erupted in a torrent of furious, scornful invective. "Am I a dog?" he roared, his voice booming across the valley. "That you come to me with sticks?" He saw David's shepherd's staff and saw not a weapon, but the kind of stick one would use to drive away a stray cur. It was the ultimate expression of contempt, a dismissal of David as something less than human. The giant, cursed by his own hubris, was making a fatal error in threat assessment. He was looking at David, but he was not truly seeing him. He saw the stick, but he failed to notice the sling. He saw a boy, but he failed to perceive the secret king. Having dismissed his opponent, Goliath then pronounced a terrible curse upon him. He cursed David by his gods. This was a standard part of the pre-battle ritual, a verbal assault designed to demoralize the enemy and to invoke the power of one's own deities, Dagon, Baal, Ashtoreth, against the opponent. He was ritually dedicating David's body to destruction. "Come to me," he bellowed, his voice thick with sadistic glee, "and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field." This was the ultimate threat of the ancient warrior, not just to kill, but to desecrate, to deny the enemy a proper burial and leave his corpse to be devoured by scavengers. This verbal barrage, the mockery, the curse, the threat, was the final phase of Goliath's psychological warfare. It was designed to shatter the nerve of any opponent, to fill him with a terror that would make his hands tremble and his heart fail. But it had no effect on David. He stood his ground, listened to the giant's rage, and then he answered. And his answer was not a boast. It was not a schoolyard taunt. It was a sermon. It was a theological manifesto, a powerful prophetic declaration that reframed the entire meaning of the combat. "You come to me," David declared, his young, clear voice cutting through the giant's bluster, "with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin." He began by acknowledging the source of Goliath's confidence, his technology, his worldly weapons, his armor of iron and bronze. He was saying, "I see your strength, I know what you trust in." And then he drew the battle line. "But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." This was the central radical claim. This was not a fight between a giant and a boy. It was a fight between the gods of the Philistines and the one true living God of Israel, the Lord of hosts, YHWH Tsevaot, a title that signifies his command over the angelic armies of heaven. David was declaring that he was merely a vessel, an agent. The true champion of Israel was God himself. David was an ambassador, and the giant's taunts had been an insult to the king he represented. He then moved from a declaration of principle to a specific, terrifying prophecy. He took Goliath's own curse and turned it back on him, but with a crucial difference. Goliath's threat was based on his own strength. "I will give your flesh to the birds." David's was a confident prediction of what God was about to do. "This day," he prophesied, "the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth." But the prophecy did not end there. David explained the ultimate purpose of this coming victory. It was not for his own glory. It was not even just for the liberation of Israel. It was for the glory of God himself. "That all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand." It was an extraordinary speech. In the space of a few sentences, David had seized control of the narrative. He had dismissed the giant's physical and technological superiority as irrelevant. He had identified the true combatants, the false gods of Philistia versus the living God of Israel. He had predicted the outcome with absolute certainty, and he had declared the ultimate purpose of the event, a universal revelation of his God's power and his unique way of operating in the world. He had turned the valley floor into a pulpit, and the duel into a demonstration of faith for the benefit of the entire world. The war of words was over. The time for action had come. The text says, "When the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine." This detail is crucial. David did not wait, he did not hesitate, he did not stand still like a terrified target. He ran towards the danger. It was an act of supreme courage and tactical brilliance. By closing the distance quickly, he reduced the time Goliath had to react and to throw his own javelin. And as he ran, his hand went into his shepherd's bag. And David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone and slung it. Imagine the scene, slowed down to its essential components. The boy is running, a fluid, practiced motion. His arm begins to whirl the sling, a blur of leather and cord, a low, menacing hum building in the air. The giant, encumbered by over 100 pounds of armor, is lumbering forward, trying to get his massive spear into a usable position. For a brief, fatal moment, Goliath is a slow-moving target. David, still running, releases the cord. The stone, smooth and dense, flies from the pouch. It does not arc high in the air like a thrown rock. It flies with a flat, deadly trajectory, a silent, almost invisible projectile traveling at a velocity of over 100 feet per second. It is a blur of motion, too fast for the human eye to properly track, too fast for the giant to dodge or block. And he struck the Philistine in his forehead. It was a perfect shot, the one small, unprotected area of the giant's entire body. The stone, carrying the kinetic energy of a bullet, did not just bounce off. The text says it sank into his forehead. It was a blow of catastrophic, penetrating force. It would have shattered the frontal bone of his skull, sending bone fragments and the stone itself deep into the frontal lobe of his brain. The effect would have been instantaneous and absolute. Goliath's central nervous system would have shut down immediately. His conscious thought, his motor control, his very life force extinguished in a microsecond. The giant's massive body, its internal command system utterly destroyed, stood for a moment, a towering monument of useless armor, and then it crashed, face first, to the earth. The sound of his fall, the thunderous clang of 100 pounds of bronze armor hitting the rocky ground, would have echoed through the valley like the crack of doom. For a moment, there must have been a profound, stunned silence. The two armies, watching from the hills, would have stared in utter, silent disbelief at the impossible sight of the fallen demigod. But David was not finished. The giant was down, but the battle had to be decisively and symbolically won. He ran forward and stood over the body of his vanquished foe. He had no sword of his own. So, in a final supreme act of divine irony, David took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. He used the giant's own massive, fearsome weapon to complete his destruction. The very symbol of the Philistines' worldly power was now the instrument of their champion's final disgrace. This was not just a killing, it was a ritual of desecration. By beheading the champion, David was utterly and completely nullifying his power and his identity, turning the fearsome warrior into a grotesque, headless trophy. The sight of this, the sight of the small shepherd boy standing over the headless corpse of their invincible champion, holding the giant's own bloody sword aloft, was the final breaking image for the Philistine army. Their morale, which had been so arrogantly high just moments before, shattered into a million pieces. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. A wave of pure, infectious panic swept through their ranks. Their god had failed. Their hero was dead. Their entire worldview had been turned upside down. They broke formation and ran, a disorganized, terrified mob. And on the other hill, the Israelite army, which had been frozen in fear for 40 days, was suddenly, miraculously, galvanized into action. The sight of their own deliverance, the impossible victory they had just witnessed, filled them with a courage they had not known they possessed. And the men of Israel and Judah rose with a shout and pursued the Philistines, the text says, as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron. They who had been the hunted now became the hunters. The battle turned into a rout, a great and bloody slaughter that followed the fleeing Philistines all the way back to their own cities. David, the shepherd boy, the secret king, had done more than just kill a giant. In the space of a few short minutes, with a single smooth stone and an unshakable faith, he had saved his nation from destruction, vindicated the honor of his God, and launched himself onto the stage of history. He had walked into the valley as a nobody, a boy on an errand. He would walk out of it as a hero, a legend, and the future of Israel. He had won the battle, but in doing so, he had ignited a new and even more dangerous conflict, the long and tragic war that would now begin for the throne of the kingdom itself. The echoes of the Great Fall had barely faded from the valley before the world began to reshape itself around the impossible event. The death of Goliath was not merely the end of a battle, it was the beginning of a new epoch, a violent and irreversible turning point in the history of Israel. The single stone slung by a shepherd boy had sent a shockwave that would topple more than just a giant. It would shatter the fragile psyche of a king, ignite a dangerous cult of celebrity, forge a bond of legendary friendship, and ultimately set in motion the long, tragic, and bloody civil war that would define the next chapter of the nation's life. The immediate aftermath of the victory was a scene of wild, chaotic triumph, but beneath the celebration, the poisonous seeds of jealousy and conflict were already beginning to sprout. This is the story of the birth of a hero and the dawning of a threat. As the Philistine army broke and fled in a state of pure superstitious terror, the Israelite army, so recently paralyzed by fear, was reborn in a cathartic explosion of violence. They rose with a single, unified war cry, a sound of 40 days of pent-up fear and humiliation being released in a single, triumphant roar. They surged down the slope of their hill, across the valley floor, past the headless corpse of the giant, and took up the pursuit of their fleeing enemies. The battle, which had been a strategic stalemate, now became a brutal, running slaughter. The Israelites, their courage miraculously restored, pursued the panicked Philistines all the way back to the gates of their own cities, Gath and Ekron, cutting down the stragglers, their bronze swords now feeling as mighty as iron in their newly confident hands. They then returned to the abandoned Philistine camp and plundered it, seizing the weapons, the supplies, and the wealth of the army that had held them in contempt for so long. It was a total and overwhelming victory. And what of the new hero? The text tells us that David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem. This is a fascinating and slightly anachronistic detail, as Jerusalem at this time was still a Jebusite stronghold, not yet the Israelite capital. But the symbolic power of the act is immense. He was taking the gruesome trophy of his victory, the ultimate proof of the Philistines' defeat, and bringing it to the city that would one day become the center of his own kingdom. It was a down payment on his own future, a prophetic act. He also took the giant's armor and weapons and put them in his own tent. He was claiming the spoils of his victory, the tools of the worldly power he had defeated, a sign that he was no longer just a shepherd, but a warrior of renown. When the victorious army returned, David was brought once more before King Saul. The king, who had watched the incredible duel from his vantage point on the hill, seems to have been in a state of bewildered shock. He had to ask his own army commander, Abner, whose son is this youth? It was a strange question. He had just spoken with David at length in his tent. But it suggests the profound transformation that had just taken place. The boy who had entered his tent as a shepherd had emerged as a national savior. Saul was trying to place him, to understand the lineage and the origin of this miraculous force that had just appeared in his kingdom. When David was brought before him, still carrying the giant's bloody, severed head, Saul asked him directly, "Whose son are you, young man?" David's answer was simple and humble. "I am the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite." He was claiming no special status, just his simple, pastoral identity. But Saul knew that this boy was now far more than just the son of Jesse. Saul took him into his service that very day, refusing to allow him to return to his father's house. The shepherd was now a permanent member of the royal court, a warrior in the king's own retinue, and in this moment a new and pivotal relationship was forged, one that would shape the rest of David's life. As soon as he had finished speaking to Saul, the text says, "The soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul." Jonathan was Saul's eldest son, the crown prince, the heir to the throne. He was a brave and celebrated warrior in his own right. But when he saw David, he felt not a sense of rivalry, but a profound, instantaneous, and spiritual kinship. He saw in this young shepherd a purity of faith and a courage that he recognized and loved. Jonathan then performed an act of extraordinary significance. He stripped himself of his own royal robes and gave them to David. He took off his own armor, his own sword, his own bow, and his own belt, and he gave them all to the shepherd boy. This was far more than a gesture of friendship. It was a deeply symbolic act of abdication. The heir to the throne was voluntarily giving the symbols of his own rank, his own power, and his own future kingship to the young man who was, though Jonathan did not yet know it, God's chosen replacement. He was symbolically transferring the royal authority from the house of Saul to the house of David. He was recognizing, with a spiritual intuition that his father lacked, that David was the true future of Israel. This act forged a covenant of friendship between the two men, a bond of selfless love that would endure through the tragic years of conflict that were to come, a bond that would ultimately save David's life from Jonathan's own father. David, now a member of the king's court, quickly proved that his victory over Goliath was no fluke. Saul began to send him out on military missions, and David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him. He was a natural leader, a brilliant strategist, a man who seemed to be blessed with a divine touch. He was quickly promoted and set over the men of war. And he was not just successful, he was universally beloved. The text tells us he was accepted in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. He had a charisma, a humility, and a charm that won the hearts of everyone, from the common soldiers to the highest officials in the court. The secret king was beginning to look very much like a real one, but it was this very popularity that would turn his triumph into a curse. The moment that planted the poisonous seed of jealousy in the king's heart came during the great triumphal procession. As the victorious army, with David at its head, returned from the slaughter of the Philistines, they were met with a nationwide celebration. The women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul, with tambourines, with songs of joy, and with musical instruments. It was a scene of pure, unadulterated national jubilation. But as the women danced, they sang a song, a simple, catchy, and politically explosive refrain that would seal David's fate. Saul has struck down his thousands, they sang, and David his 10,000s. The song was a spontaneous and joyful expression of the people's gratitude, a simple piece of poetic hyperbole meant to praise their new hero. But to the ears of the failed and deeply insecure King Saul, these words were not a song of praise, they were a declaration of treason. He heard the fatal comparison, the mathematical proof of his own diminishment. 1,000 for the king, 10,000 for the shepherd boy. He saw in this simple song the seeds of a political coup. And Saul was very angry, the text says, and this saying displeased him. He said, "They have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed thousands, and what more can he have but the kingdom?" In that moment, Saul finally understood, in his own paranoid way, the true significance of the boy he had brought into his court. This was not just a successful young commander. This was the neighbor who is better than you, that the prophet Samuel had prophesied about years before. This was his replacement. And Saul eyed David from that day on. The paternal affection he had shown was gone, replaced by a cold, murderous suspicion. The man who had been his champion was now his rival. The boy who had saved his kingdom was now the greatest threat to his throne. The harmful spirit from the Lord, which had been temporarily soothed by David's harp playing in the past, now rushed back upon Saul with a new and violent intensity, an intensity fueled by jealousy and political terror. The conflict erupted into open violence shortly after. As David was playing the lyre in the king's presence, as was his duty, Saul was seized by one of his dark moods. He was holding a spear in his hand. And as he looked at the young man who was now the hero of Israel, his paranoia and rage boiled over. He hurled the spear at David, intending to pin him to the wall. David, with the quick reflexes of a man who had fought lions, dodged the spear, which quivered in the wall beside him. This was not a random fit of madness. It was a deliberate, calculated attempt at assassination. The king himself had tried to murder his most loyal and successful commander. The war had come home. Saul would try to kill him again, and when his direct assaults failed, he resorted to a more cunning and sinister strategy. He decided to use the Philistines to do his dirty work for him. He remembered the promise he had made to the man who killed Goliath, the hand of his own daughter in marriage. He now decided to make good on that promise, but with a deadly twist. He offered his elder daughter, Merab, to David, saying, "Only be valiant for me and fight the Lord's battles." It was a trap. Saul thought to himself, "Let not my hand be upon him, but let the hand of the Philistines be upon him." He was sending David on increasingly dangerous, near-suicidal missions, hoping that his rival would be killed in battle, absolving Saul of the crime. But David, with a display of profound humility, initially demurred the honor of marrying the princess, and Saul, in a final act of public humiliation, gave Merab to another man. But Saul had another daughter, Michal, and she was in love with David. When Saul heard of this, he saw a new opportunity for his deadly trap. He offered Michal to David, but this time he would set a bride price, a task so gruesome and so dangerous that he was certain it would lead to David's death. He did not ask for gold or silver. He said to David, "The king desires no bride price except 100 foreskins of the Philistines, that he may be avenged of the king's enemies." It was a barbaric and perilous demand. To acquire 100 foreskins, David would have to kill 100 Philistine warriors in close quarters combat, and then perform the grisly work of mutilating their corpses. It was a mission from which Saul was sure he would not return. But Saul had once again underestimated the man he was dealing with. David, far from being intimidated, was delighted by the offer. He saw it as a chance to prove his valor and to officially become the king's son-in-law. He took his men, went out, and instead of killing 100 Philistines, he killed 200. He returned to the court and presented the 200 bloody foreskins to the king, a gruesome and undeniable fulfillment of the bride price. Saul was trapped. He had no choice but to give his daughter Michal to David in marriage. His plot had not only failed, it had backfired spectacularly. He had tried to get David killed, but he had only succeeded in doubling his son-in-law's military reputation and cementing his place within the royal family itself. The victory in the valley was now a distant memory. The joyous songs of the women had turned into a funeral dirge for the relationship between the king and his hero. The triumph had unleashed a torrent of jealousy, paranoia, and murderous intent that was now the driving force of the kingdom. David, the boy who had walked into the valley to save the honor of Saul's army, was now a fugitive in Saul's own court, dodging spears and fighting for his life, not against a foreign giant, but against the maddened king of his own people. The giant was dead, but a new and far more insidious monster had been born from his ashes, the monster of the king's own fear. And this was a monster that would haunt David for years to come, turning his heroic victory into the first chapter of a long and tragic story of exile, conflict, and civil war. The victory in the Valley of Elah was supposed to be an ending, a glorious conclusion to a period of national terror. Instead, it was a violent and tragic beginning. The fall of the giant had unleashed a force far more destructive and insidious than the Philistine army, the corrosive, murderous jealousy of a rejected king. David, the hero who had saved the nation, was now a marked man, the object of King Saul's obsessive, paranoid hatred. The royal court, which should have been a place of honor and reward, had become a viper's nest, a gilded cage where the young champion was forced to dodge the literal and metaphorical spears of his own father-in-law. The final chapter of this story is not about the aftermath of a single battle, but about the long, sorrowful shadow that victory cast, a shadow that would drive David from the palace into a life of exile and set the stage for a long and bloody civil war. This is the story of how the giant's sword, a symbol of a great victory, became the burden of a fugitive's life. The conflict between Saul and David was now the central, defining reality of the kingdom. Saul's attempts to kill David grew more frequent and more desperate. The harmful spirit that tormented him was now almost permanently fused with his jealousy of the young hero. He made no secret of his intentions, commanding his own son Jonathan and all his servants to kill David. But the bond between Jonathan and David, the covenant of selfless friendship forged in the moments after the great victory, now became David's lifeline. Jonathan, torn between his loyalty to his father and his love for his friend, chose to honor his covenant. He warned David of the danger, acted as a secret intermediary, and even managed to temporarily soothe his father's rage, convincing Saul to swear an oath that he would not harm David. But the peace was fragile, a thin layer of ice over a deep, raging river of paranoia. The moment it shattered came after David won yet another stunning military victory against the Philistines. As David returned, a hero once more, Saul was again seized by his tormenting spirit. And as David played the lyre to soothe him, the king hurled his spear for a third time. David dodged it again and fled the palace that night, a fugitive for good. Saul sent soldiers to watch David's house with orders to kill him in the morning. But David's wife, Saul's own daughter Michal, engineered his escape. She let him down through a window under the cover of darkness. Then, in a clever act of deception, she took a household idol, a teraphim, placed it in their bed, put a net of goat's hair on its head, and covered it with a blanket. When Saul's messengers arrived to arrest David, she told them he was sick. When Saul angrily demanded they bring him in his bed so he could kill him himself, the messengers discovered the ruse. David was long gone. His own wife and his best friend, the king's own children, had chosen to save the hero over obeying their father. David was now an outlaw, a man on the run from the very king he had served and saved. He fled to the town of Ramah to seek refuge with the aged prophet Samuel, the man who had secretly anointed him years before. It was a reunion of the rejected kingmaker and the secret king. But even the holy presence of the prophet was not a safe haven. Saul, hearing of his location, sent 3 separate companies of soldiers to arrest him. But as each company approached the community of prophets at Ramah, the text says the Spirit of God came upon them, and they too began to prophesy, falling into an ecstatic trance, their mission completely forgotten. Finally, in a fit of rage, Saul decided to go himself. But as he approached Ramah, the same Spirit of God came upon him. He stripped off his royal robes and lay naked on the ground, prophesying in a prophetic frenzy for a whole day and a whole night. It was a bizarre and humiliating spectacle, a final public demonstration of God's power over the king he had rejected. The spirit that had rushed upon David at his anointing was now a force that unmanned and disgraced Saul. David, using the opportunity to escape, arranged one last secret and heartbreaking meeting with Jonathan to determine if there was any hope of reconciliation with the king. They devised a plan. David would hide in a field, and Jonathan would test his father's mood. The test proved what they both already feared. At a royal feast, when Saul noted David's empty seat, Jonathan made an excuse for his absence. Saul's reaction was explosive. He flew into a volcanic rage, viciously insulting Jonathan and his own mother. "You son of a perverse, rebellious woman," he screamed, his words dripping with contempt. "For as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, neither you nor your kingdom shall be established. Therefore send and bring him to me, for he shall surely die." When Jonathan dared to question his father, asking, "Why should he be put to death? What has he done?" Saul, in a final, insane act of fury, hurled his own spear at his son, the heir to his throne. The break was now absolute and irreparable. Jonathan, his heart filled with grief for his friend and shame for his father, went out to the field and, using a pre-arranged signal of arrows, let David know that he had to flee for his life. Their final farewell was a scene of profound sorrow. They wept together, embracing as brothers, their friendship a single bright light in a world that had descended into darkness and madness. "Go in peace," Jonathan said, "for we have sworn both of us in the name of the Lord. The Lord shall be between me and you, and between my offspring and your offspring, forever." They would never see each other again. David was now truly alone, a fugitive with a price on his head. He began a long and desperate period of exile, wandering in the wilderness, hiding in caves, and gathering around him a motley crew of followers. Everyone who was in distress, and everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was bitter in soul. He had become the captain of a band of outlaws, the rejected men of Israel gathering around their rejected secret king. And it was during this time of flight that he had a fateful encounter that would bring the story of Goliath full circle. Fleeing from Saul's soldiers, desperate and hungry, David came to the priestly town of Nob. There he met the high priest Ahimelech. He lied to the priest, pretending to be on a secret mission for the king, and asked for food and a weapon. Ahimelech, though suspicious, gave him the only food he had on hand, the holy bread of the presence, which was reserved only for priests. Then David asked, "Is there not a spear or a sword here?" And the priest replied with words that must have sent a chill down David's spine. "The sword of Goliath the Philistine, whom you struck down in the valley of Elah," he said. "Behold, it is here, wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If you will take that, take it, for there is no other but that here, the sword of Goliath, the massive, terrifying weapon of the giant he had slain, the symbol of his greatest victory, had been preserved as a holy relic in the sanctuary of God. It was a testament to the day the Lord had saved Israel through the hand of a shepherd boy. And now, that same boy, a fugitive running for his life, was being offered the giant's sword. "There is none like that," David said, his voice filled with a grim irony. "Give it to me." He took the sword of the giant, the very weapon that had launched him into the center of the nation's life, and with it, he fled further into the wilderness. The symbol of his heroic ascent was now the tool of his desperate survival. The victory in the valley had come at a terrible price, and the weight of that giant's sword was a burden he would now have to carry for years to come. The legacy of that single afternoon in the valley of Elah was therefore a complex and tragic one. For the nation of Israel, it became their foundational myth, the ultimate underdog story, a timeless and powerful narrative that would sustain them for centuries. It was the story of how their God saves not with sword and spear, a declaration that their true strength lay not in military might, but in their covenant faithfulness. The image of the shepherd boy felling the giant became the ultimate metaphor for the triumph of faith over fear, of unconventional weakness over worldly, arrogant strength. It was a story that would echo through the Psalms of David himself, through the prophecies of Isaiah, and would become a cornerstone of the Western imagination, a story told and retold to give hope to the powerless in the face of overwhelming odds. But for the individuals involved, the legacy was one of profound personal tragedy. For Goliath, it was a legacy of disgrace, his name becoming a byword for arrogant, blasphemous power that is ultimately brought low. For King Saul, the victory was the beginning of his final tragic descent into madness and despair. The rise of the hero he had enabled became the obsession that would consume him, turning him from a king into a hunter, a man who spent the final years of his reign chasing the ghost of his own replacement through the wilderness, a tragic, Lear-like figure abandoned by his God and his own children. And for David, the victory was both his making and his curse. It was the event that revealed his divine anointing to the world and set him on the undeniable path to the throne. But it was a path that led not through a palace, but through years of hardship, exile, and constant danger. The act of violence he had committed in that valley, the beheading of the giant, was a necessary act of national salvation, but it was also an initiation into a world of bloodshed that would follow him for the rest of his days. His reign as king, when it finally came, would be defined by almost constant warfare. His own household would be torn apart by violence, by the rebellion of his son Absalom, by murder and by intrigue. The man of faith who had won a great victory with a single stone would become a man of war, a man whose hands were, by his own admission, too bloody to be allowed to build God's temple. The victory was glorious, but the shadow of the giant was very long. It stretched from that valley, through the years of his exile, across the decades of his reign, a permanent reminder that the path to a throne is often paved with blood and sorrow, and that the greatest triumphs can carry with them the seeds of our deepest tragedies. The shepherd had killed the giant, but the weight of that giant's sword would be a burden he would carry for the rest of his life.